Survival in Auschwitz. 1. The journey. I was captured by the fascist militia on 13 December 1943. I was 24, with little wisdom, no experience, and a decided tendency, encouraged by the life of segregation forced on me for the previous 4 years by the racial laws, to live in an unrealistic world of my own, a world inhabited by civilized Cartesian phantoms, by sincere male and bloodless female friendships. I cultivated a moderate and abstract sense of rebellion. It had been by no means easy to flee into the mountains and to help set up what, both in my opinion and in that of friends little more experienced than myself, should have become a partisan band affiliated with the resistance movement, justice and liberty. Contacts, arms, money, and the experience needed to acquire them were all missing. We lacked capable men, and instead we were swamped by a deluge of outcasts, in good or bad faith, who came from the plain in search of a non-existent military or political organization, of arms, or merely of protection, a hiding place, a fire, a pair of shoes. At the moment of my arrival, that is, at the end of January 1944, there were about 150 Italian Jews in the camp, but within a few weeks their number rose to over 600. For the most part, they consisted of entire families captured by the fascists or Nazis through their imprudence or following secret accusations. A few had given themselves up spontaneously, reduced to desperation by the vagabond life, or because they lacked the means to survive, or to avoid separation from a captured relation, or even, absurdly, to be in conformity with the law. There were also about 100 Yugoslavian military internees and a few other foreigners who were politically suspect. The arrival of a squad of German SS men should have made even the optimists doubtful, but we still managed to interpret the novelty in various ways without drawing the most obvious conclusions. Thus, despite everything, the announcement of the deportation caught us all unawares. On 20 February, the Germans had inspected the camp with care and had publicly and loudly upbraided the Italian commissar for the defective organization of the kitchen service and for the scarce amount of wood distribution for heating. They even said that an infirmary would soon be opened. But on the morning of the 21st, we learned that on the following day the Jews would be leaving. All the Jews, without exception. Even the children, even the old, even the ill. Our destination? Nobody knew. We should be prepared for a fortnight of travel. For every person missing at the roll call, 10 would be shot. Only a minority of ingenuous and deluded souls continued to hope. We others had often spoken with the Polish and Croat refugees, and we knew what departure meant. For people condemned to death, tradition prescribes an austere ceremony, calculated to emphasize that all passions and anger have died down, and that the act of justice represents only a sad duty towards society, which moves even the executioner to pity for the victim. Thus the condemned man is shielded from all external cares. He is granted solitude, and should he want it, spiritual comfort. In short, care is taken that he should feel around him neither hatred nor arbitrariness, only necessity and justice, and by means of punishment, pardon. But to us this was not granted, for we were many and time was short, and in any case, what had we to repent? For what crime did we need pardon? The Italian commissar accordingly decreed that all services should continue to function until the final notice. The kitchens remained open. The corvées for cleaning worked as usual, and even the teachers of the little school gave lessons until the evening, as on other days. But that evening the children were given no homework. Two on the bottom. The journey did not last more than 20 minutes. Then the lorry stopped and we saw a large door, and above it a sign, brightly illuminated. Its memory still strikes me in my dreams. Arbeit macht frei. Work gives freedom. We climb down, they make us enter an enormous empty room that is poorly heated. We have a terrible thirst. The weak gurgle of the water in the radiators makes us ferocious. We have had nothing to drink for 4 days, but there is also a tap, and above it, a card which says that it is forbidden to drink as the water is dirty. Nonsense! It seems obvious that the card is a joke. They know that we are dying of thirst, and they put us in a room, and there is a tap, and Wasser trinken verboten. I drink and I incite my companions to do likewise. But I have to spit it out. The water is tepid and sweetish, with the smell of a swamp. This is hell. Today, in our times, hell must be like this. A huge empty room. We are tired, standing on our feet, with a tap which drips while we cannot drink the water, and we wait for something which will certainly be terrible. And nothing happens and nothing continues to happen. What can one think about? One cannot think any more. It is like being already dead. Someone sits down on the ground. The time passes drop by drop. We are not dead. The door is opened and an SS man enters, smoking. He looks at us slowly and asks, "Wer kann Deutsch?" One of us whom I have never seen, named Flesh, moves forward. He will be our interpreter. The SS man makes a long, calm speech. The interpreter translates. We have to form rows of 5, with intervals of 2 yards between man and man. Then we have to undress and make a bundle of the clothes in a special manner. The woolen garments on one side, all the rest on the other. We must take off our shoes, but pay great attention that they are not stolen. Three, initiation. After the first day of capricious transfer from hut to hut and from commando to commando, I am assigned to Block 30 late one evening and shown a bunk in which Diana is already sleeping. Diana wakes up and, although exhausted, makes room for me and receives me hospitably. I am not sleepy, or more accurately, my sleepiness is masked by a state of tension and anxiety of which I have not yet managed to rid myself. And so I talk and talk. I have too many things to ask. I am hungry, and when will they distribute the soup tomorrow? And will I be able to eat it without a spoon? And where will I be able to find one? And where will they send me to work? Diana knows no more than I, and replies with other questions. But from above and below, from nearby and from far away, from all corners of the now dark hut, sleepy and angry voices shout at me. I understand that they are ordering me to be quiet, but the word is new to me, and since I do not know its meaning and implications, my inquietude increases. Eight. This side of good and evil. We had an incorrigible tendency to see a symbol and a sign in every event. For 70 days we had been waiting for the Waschtauschen, the ceremony of the change of underclothes, and a rumor circulated persistently that the change of washing had not taken place because, as the front had moved forward, the Germans were unable to gather together new transport at Auschwitz, and therefore the liberation was near. And equally the opposite interpretation circulated, that the delay in the change was a sure sign of an approaching integral liquidation of the camp. Instead, the change took place, and as usual, The directors of the lager took every care to make it occur unexpectedly, and at the same time in all of the huts. Chemical examination. Commando 98, called the Chemical Commando, should have been a squad of skilled workers. The day on which its formation was officially announced, a meager group of 15 Haflinger gathered in the grey of dawn around the new capo in the roll call square. This was the first disillusion. He was a green triangle, a professional delinquent. The Arbeitsdienst had not thought it necessary for the capo of the chemical commando to be a chemist. It was pointless wasting one's breath asking him questions. He would not have replied, or else he would have replied with kicks and shouts. On the other hand, his not very robust appearance and his smaller-than-average stature were reassuring. He made a short speech in the foul German of the barracks, and the disillusion was confirmed. So these were the chemists. Well, he was Alex, and if they thought they were entering paradise, they were mistaken. In the first place, until the day production began, Commando 98 would be no more than an ordinary transport commando, attached to the magnesium chloride warehouse. Secondly, if they imagined, being intellectuals, that they could make a fool of him, Alex, a Reichsdeutscher, well, Herrgottssakrament, he would show them, he would, and with his fist clenched and index finger extended, he cut across the air with the menacing gesture of the Germans. And finally, they should not imagine that they would fool anyone if they had applied for the position without any qualifications. An examination, yes, gentlemen, in the very near future. A chemistry examination before the triumvirate of the polymerization department, Dr. Hagen, Dr. Probst, and Dr. Ingenieur Panwitz. And with this, mein Herren, although time had been lost, Commandos 96 and 97 had already started, forward march, and to begin with, whosoever failed to walk in line and step would have to deal with him. He was a capo like all the other capos. (15) Die drei Leute vom Labor. How many months have gone by since we entered the camp? How many since the day I was dismissed from Kabe? And since the day of the chemistry examination? And since the October selection? Alberto and I often asked ourselves these questions, and many others as well. We were 96 when we arrived, we, the Italians of Convoy 174,000. Only 29 of us survived until October, and of these, 8 went into the selection. We are now 21 and the winter has hardly begun. How many of us will be alive at the new year? How many when spring begins? There have been no air raids now for several weeks. The November rain has turned to snow, and the snow has covered the ruins. The Germans and Poles go to work in rubber jack boots, woolen ear pads, and padded overalls. The English prisoners have their wonderful fur-lined jackets. They have distributed no overcoats in our lager, except to a few of the privileged. We are a specialized commando, which, in theory, only works under shelter. So we are left in our summer outfits. (16) The last one. By now Christmas is approaching. Alberto and I are walking side by side in the long grey file, bending forwards to resist the wind better. It is night and it is snowing. It is not easy to keep on one's feet, and even more difficult to keep up the pace and line. Every now and again someone in front of us stumbles and falls in the black mud, and one has to be careful to avoid him and keep one's place in the column. Since I started work in the laboratory, Alberto and I work separately, and we always have many things to tell each other on the return march. They are not usually things on a high level. About work, or our comrades, or the bread or the cold. But for a week now there had been something new. Every evening, Lorenzo brings us 6 or 8 pints of soup from the Italian civilian workers. To solve the problem of transport, we had to procure what is called a menashka, where here that is a zinc pot made to order, more like a bucket than a pot. Silberlust, the tinsmith, made it for us from 2 scraps of a gutter in exchange for 3 rations of bread. It was a splendid, sturdy, capacious pitcher, with the characteristic shape of a Neolithic tool. In the whole camp there are only a few Greeks who have a menashka larger than ours. Besides the material advantages, it carries with it a perceptible improvement in our social standing. A menashka like ours is a diploma of nobility, a heraldic emblem. Henry is becoming our friend and speaks to us on equal terms. El has assumed a paternal and condescending air. As for Elias, he is perpetually at our side, and although he spies on us with tenacity to discover the secret of our organization, he overwhelms us at the same time with incomprehensible declarations of solidarity and affection, and deafens us with a litany of portentous obscenities and oaths in Italian and French, which he learned somewhere, and by which he obviously means to honor us. As for the moral aspect of the new state of affairs, Alberto and I are forced to agree that there is nothing to be very proud of, but it is so easy to find justifications. Besides, the very fact that we have some new things to talk about is no negligible gain. We talk about our plan to buy a second menashka to rotate with the first, so that to make only 1 expedition a day to the remote corner of the yard, where Lorenzo is now working, will be sufficient. We speak about Lorenzo and how to reward him. Later, if we return, we will of course do everything we can for him, but of what use is it to talk about that? He knows as well as us that we can hardly hope to return. We ought to do something at once. We could try to have his shoes repaired at the cobbler's shop in our lager, where repairs are free. It seems a paradox, but officially everything was free in the extermination camps. Alberto will try. He is a friend of the head cobbler. Perhaps a few pints of soup will be enough. We talk about 3 new exploits of ours, and we agree that for obvious reasons of professional secrecy, it is inadvisable to talk about them at large. It is a pity. Our personal prestige would be greatly increased. The story of 10 days. Already for some months now, the distant booming of the Russian guns had been heard at intervals, when on 11 January 1945 I fell ill of scarlet fever and was once more sent into Kabe. Infection sabtelang. It meant a small room, really quite clean, with 10 bunks on 2 levels, a wardrobe, 3 stools, and a closet seat, with a pail for corporal needs, all in a space of 3 yards by 5. It was difficult to climb to the upper bunks as there was no ladder, so when a patient got worse he was transferred to the lower bunks. When I was admitted, I was the 13th in the room. 4 of the others, 2 French political prisoners and 2 young Hungarian Jews, had scarlet fever. There were 3 with diphtheria, 2 with typhus, while 1 suffered from a repellent facial erysipelas. The other 2 had more than 1 illness and were incredibly wasted away. I had a high fever. I was lucky enough to have a bunk entirely to myself. I lay down with relief, knowing that I had the right to 40 days isolation and therefore of rest, while I felt myself still sufficiently strong to fear neither the consequences of scarlet fever nor the selections. Thanks to my by now long experience of camp life, I managed to bring with me all my personal belongings: a belt of interlaced electric wire, the knife spoon, a needle with 3 needlefuls, 5 buttons, and last of all 18 flints which I had stolen from the laboratory. From each of these, shaping them patiently with the knife, it was possible to make 3 smaller flints, just the right gauge for a normal cigarette lighter. They were valued at 6 or 7 rations of bread. I enjoyed 4 peaceful days. Outside it was snowing and very cold, but the room was heated. I was given strong doses of sulfur drugs. I suffered from an intense feeling of sickness and was hardly able to eat. I did not want to talk. The 2 Frenchmen with scarlet fever were quite pleasant. They were provincials from the Vosges who had entered the camp only a few days before with the large convoy of civilians swept up by the Germans in their retreat from Lorraine. The elder one was named Arthur, a peasant, small and thin. The other, his bed companion, was Charles, a schoolteacher, 32 years old. Instead of a shirt, he had been given a summer vest, ridiculously short. On the 5th day, the barber came. He was a Greek from Salonika. He spoke only the beautiful Spanish of his people, but understood some words of all the languages spoken in the camp. He was called Ashkenazi and had been in the camp for almost 3 years. I do not know how he managed to get the post of friseur of Kabe. He spoke neither German nor Polish, nor was he in fact excessively brutal. Before he entered, I heard him speaking excitedly for a long time in the corridor with one of the doctors, a compatriot of his. He seemed to have an unusual look on his face, but as the expressions of the Levantines are different from ours, I could not tell whether he was afraid or happy or merely upset. He knew me, or at least knew that I was Italian. When it was my turn, I climbed down laboriously from the bunk. I asked him in Italian if there was anything new. He stopped shaving me, winked in a serious and elusive manner, pointed to the window with his chin, and then made a sweeping gesture with his hand towards the west. Morgen alle Kamerad Wedge. He looked at me for a moment with his eyes wide open, as if waiting for a reaction, and then he added todos, and returned to his work. He knew about my flints and shaved me with a certain gentleness. The news excited no direct emotion in me. Already for many months I had no longer felt any pain, joy or fear, except in that detached and distant manner characteristic of the lager, which might be described as conditional. If I still had my former sensitivity, I thought, this would be an extremely moving moment. My ideas were perfectly clear. For a long time now, Alberto and I had foreseen the dangers which would accompany the evacuation of the camp and the liberation. As for the rest, Ashkenazi's news was merely a confirmation of rumors which had been circulating for some days, that the Russians were at Senstochowa, 60 miles to the north, and that they were at Zakopane, 60 miles to the south, that at Buna the Germans were already preparing the sabotage mines. I looked at the faces of my comrades, one by one. It was clearly useless to discuss it with any of them. They would have replied, well, and it would all have finished there. The French were different, they were still fresh. Did you hear? I said to them. Tomorrow they are going to evacuate the camp. They overwhelmed me with questions. Where to? On foot? The ill ones as well? Those who cannot walk? They knew that I was an old prisoner and that I understood German, and deduced that I knew much more about the matter than I wanted to admit. I did not know anything more. I told them so, but they continued to ask questions. How stupid of them. But of course they had only been in the lager for a week and had not yet learned that one did not ask questions. In the afternoon the Greek doctor came. He said that all patients able to walk would be given shoes and clothes and would leave the following day, with the healthy ones on a 12-mile march. The others would remain in Kabe with assistants to be chosen from the patients least ill. The doctor was unusually cheerful. He seemed drunk. I knew him. He was a cultured, intelligent man, egoistic and calculating. He added that everyone, without distinction, would receive a triple ration of bread, at which the patients visibly cheered up. We asked him what would happen to us. He replied that probably the Germans would leave us to our fate. No, he did not think that they would kill us. He made no effort to hide the fact that he thought otherwise. His very cheerfulness boded ill. He was already equipped for the march. He had hardly gone out when the two Hungarian boys began to speak excitedly to one another. They were in an advanced state of convalescence, but extremely wasted away. It was obvious that they were afraid to stay with the patients and were deciding to go with the healthy ones. It was not a question of reasoning. I would probably also have followed the instinct of the flock if I had not felt so weak. Fear is supremely contagious, and its immediate reaction is to make one try to run away. Outside the hut, the camp sounded unusually excited. One of the two Hungarians got up, went out, and returned half an hour later, laden with filthy rags. He must have taken them from the storehouse of clothes still to be disinfected. He and his comrade dressed feverishly, putting on rag after rag. One could see that they were in a hurry to leave the matter over, before the fear itself made them hesitate. It was crazy of them to think of walking even for 1 hour, weak as they were, especially in the snow with those broken-down shoes found at the last moment. I tried to explain, but they looked at me without replying. Their eyes were like those of terrified cattle. Just for a moment it flashed through my mind that they might be right. They climbed awkwardly out of the window. I saw them, shapeless bundles, lurching into the night. They did not return. I learnt much later that, unable to continue, they had been killed by the SS a few hours after the beginning of the march. It was obvious that I, too, needed a pair of shoes, but it took me an hour to overcome the feeling of sickness, fever, and inertia. I found a pair in the corridor. The healthy prisoners had ransacked the deposit of patients' shoes and had taken the best ones. Those remaining, with split soles and unpaired, lay all over the place. Just then I met Kosman, the Alsatian. As a civilian, he had been a Reuters correspondent at Clermont-Ferrand. He also was excited and euphoric. He said, "If you return before me, write to the mayor of Metz that I am about to come back." Kosman was notorious for his acquaintances among the prominents, so his optimism seemed a good sign, and I used it to justify my inertia to myself. I hid the shoes and returned to bed. Late that night, the Greek doctor returned with a rucksack on his shoulders and a woolen hood. He threw a French novel on my bed. "Keep it, read it, Italian. You can give it back to me when we meet again." Even today I hate him for those words. He knew that we were doomed. And then finally Alberto came, defying the prohibition, to say goodbye to me from the window. We were inseparable. We were the two Italians, and foreigners even mistook our names. For 6 months we had shared a bunk and every scrap of food organized in excess of the ration. But he had had scarlet fever as a child, and I was unable to infect him. So he left, and I remained. We said goodbye. Not many words were needed. We had already discussed our affairs countless times. We did not think we would be separated for very long. He had found a sturdy pair of leather shoes in a reasonable condition. He was one of those fellows who immediately find everything they need. He also was cheerful and confident, as were all those who were leaving. It was understandable. Something great and new was about to happen. We could finally feel a force around us, which was not of Germany. We could concretely feel the impending collapse of that hated world of ours. At any rate, the healthy ones who, despite all their tiredness and hunger, were still able to move, could feel this. But it is obvious that whoever is too weak, or naked or barefoot, thinks and feels in a different way, and what dominated our thoughts was the paralyzing sensation of being totally helpless in the hands of fate. All the healthy prisoners, except a few prudent ones who at the last moment undressed and hid themselves in the hospital beds, left during the night of 18 January 1945. They must have been about 20,000, coming from different camps. Almost in their entirety they vanished during the evacuation march. Alberto was among them. Perhaps someone will write their story one day. So we remained in our bunks. alone with our illnesses, and with our inertia stronger than fear. In the whole Kabe, we were numbered perhaps 800. In our room there were 11 of us, each in his own bunk, except for Charles and Arthur, who slept together. The rhythm of the great machine of the lager was extinguished. For us began 10 days outside both world and time. 18 January. During the night of the evacuation, the camp kitchens continued to function, and on the following morning, the late distribution of soup took place in the hospital. The central heating plant had been abandoned. In the huts, a little heat still lingered on. But hour by hour, the temperature dropped, and it was evident that we would soon suffer from the cold. Outside it must have been at least 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Below zero, most of the patients had only a shirt, and some of them not even that. Nobody knew what our fate would be. Some SS men had remained. Some of the guard towers were still occupied. About midday, an SS officer made a tour of the huts. He appointed a chief in each of them, selecting from among the remaining non-Jews, and ordered a list of the patients to be made at once, divided into Jews and non-Jews. The matter seemed clear. No one was surprised that the Germans preserved their national love of classification until the very end, nor did any Jew seriously expect to live until the following day. The 2 Frenchmen had not understood and were frightened. I translated the speech of the SS men. I was annoyed that they should be afraid. They had not even experienced a month of the lager. They hardly suffered from hunger. They were not even Jews, but they were afraid. There was one more distribution of bread. I spent the afternoon reading the book left by the doctor. It was interesting, and I can remember it with curious accuracy. I also made a visit to the neighboring ward, in search of blankets. Many patients had been sent out from there, and their blankets were free. I brought back some quite heavy ones. When Arthur heard that they came from the dysentery ward, he looked disgusted. In fact, they were polluted. But I thought that in any case, knowing what awaited us, we might as well sleep comfortably. It was soon night, but the electric light remained on. We saw with tranquil fear that an armed SS man stood at the corner of the hut. I had no desire to talk, and was not afraid except in that external and conditional manner I have described. I continued reading until late. There were no clocks, but it must have been about 11 p.m. when all the lights went out, even those of the reflectors on the guard towers. One could see the searchlight beams in the distance. A cluster of intense lights burst out in the sky, remaining immobile, crudely illuminating the earth. One could hear the roar of the airplanes. Then the bombardment began. It was nothing new. I climbed down to the ground, put my bare feet into my shoes, and waited. It seemed far away, perhaps over Auschwitz. But then there was a near explosion, and before one could think, a second and a third one, loud enough to burst one's eardrums. Windows were breaking. The hut shook. The spoon I had fixed in the wall fell down. Then it seemed all over. Cagnolati, a young peasant also from the Vosges, had apparently never experienced a raid. He had jumped out naked from his bed and was concealed in a corner, screaming. After a few minutes it was obvious that the camp had been struck. 2 huts were burning fiercely. Another 2 had been pulverized. But they were all empty. Dozens of patients arrived, naked and wretched, from a hut threatened by fire. They asked for shelter. It was impossible to take them in. They insisted, begging and threatening in many languages. We had to barricade the door. They dragged themselves elsewhere, lit up by the flames, barefoot in the melting snow. Many trailed behind them, streaming bandages. There seemed no danger to our hut so long as the wind did not change. The Germans were no longer there. The towers were empty. Today I think that if for no other reason than that an Auschwitz existed, no one in our age should speak of providence. But without doubt, in that hour the memory of biblical salvations in times of extreme adversity passed like a wind through all our minds. It was impossible to sleep. A window was broken and it was very cold. I was thinking that we would have to find a stove to set up and get some coal, wood, and food. I knew that it was all essential, but without some help I would never have had the energy to carry it out. I spoke about it to the two Frenchmen. 19 January. The Frenchmen agreed. We got up at dawn, we three. I felt ill and helpless. I was cold and afraid. The other patients looked at us with respectful curiosity. Did we not know that patients were not allowed to leave Kabe? And if the Germans had not all left? But they said nothing. They were glad that someone was prepared to make the test. We went out into the wind of a freezing day of fog, poorly wrapped up in blankets. What we saw resembled nothing that I had ever seen or heard described. The lager, hardly dead, had already begun to decompose. No more water or electricity. Broken windows and doors slamming to in the wind. Loose iron sheets from the roofs screeching. Ashes from the fire drifting high afar. The work of the bombs had been completed by the work of man. Ragged, decrepit, skeleton-like patients, at all able to move, dragged themselves everywhere on the frozen soil, like an invasion of worms. They had ransacked all the empty huts in search of food and wood. They had violated with senseless fury the grotesquely adorned rooms of the hated Blockadtester, forbidden to the ordinary Häftlinge until the previous day. No longer in control of their own bowels, they had fouled everywhere, polluting the precious snow, the only source of water remaining in the whole camp. Around the smoking ruins of the burnt huts, groups of patients lay stretched out on the ground, soaking up its last warmth. Others had found potatoes somewhere and were roasting them on the embers of the fire, glaring around with fierce eyes. A few had had the strength to light a real fire and were melting snow in it in any handy receptacle. We hurried to the kitchens as fast as we could, but the potatoes were almost finished. We filled 2 sacks and left them in Arthur's keeping. Among the ruins of the Prominence block, Charles and I finally found what we were searching for, a heavy cast iron stove, with the flue still usable. Charles hurried over with a wheelbarrow, and we loaded it on. He then left me with the task of carrying it to the hut, and ran back to the sacks. There he found Arthur unconscious from the cold. Charles picked up both sacks and carried them to safety. Then he took care of his friend. Meanwhile, staggering with difficulty, I was trying to maneuver the heavy wheelbarrow as best as possible. There was the roar of an engine, and an SS man entered the camp on a motorcycle. As always, when I saw their hard faces, I froze from terror and hatred. It was too late to disappear, and I did not want to abandon the stove. The rules of the lager stated that one must stand at attention with head uncovered. I had no hat and was unencumbered by the blanket. I moved a few steps away from the wheelbarrow and made a sort of awkward bow. The German moved on without seeing me, turned behind the hut, and left. Only later did I realize the danger I had run. I finally reached the entrance of the hut and unloaded the stove into Charles's hands. I was completely breathless from the effort. Large black spots danced before my eyes. It was essential to get it working. We all three had our hands paralyzed, while the icy metal stuck to the skin of our fingers. But it was vitally urgent to set it up to warm ourselves and to boil the potatoes. We had found wood and coal, as well as embers from the burnt huts. When the broken window was repaired and the stove began to spread its heat, something seemed to relax in everyone. and at that moment Towarowski, a Franco-Pole of 23, typhus, proposed to the others that each of them offer a slice of bread to us, 3 who had been working, and so it was agreed. Only a day before, a similar event would have been inconceivable. The law of the lager said, eat your own bread and if you can, that of your neighbor, and left no room for gratitude. It really meant that the lager was dead. It was the first human gesture that occurred among us. I believe that that moment can be dated as the beginning of the change by which we who had not died slowly changed from halfling to men again. Arthur recovered quite well, but from then on always avoided exposing himself to the cold. He undertook the upkeep of the stove, the cooking of the potatoes, the cleaning of the room, and the helping of the patients. Charles and I shared the various tasks outside. There was still an hour of light. An expedition yielded us a pint of spirits and a tin of yeast, thrown in the snow by someone. We made a distribution of potatoes and 1 spoonful of yeast per person. I thought vaguely that it might help against lack of vitamins. Darkness fell. In the hell camp, ours was the only room with a stove, of which we were very proud. Many invalids from other wards crowded around the door, but Charles's imposing stature held them back. Nobody, neither us nor them, thought that the inevitable promiscuity with our patients made it extremely dangerous to stay in our room, and to fall ill of diphtheria in those conditions was more surely fatal than jumping off a 4th floor. Arthur climbed down enthusiastically from his bed, and heated 3 potatoes per person from those boiled the day before. After which, Charles and I, starved and shivering violently, left again to explore the decaying camp. We had enough food for 2 days only. As for water, we were forced to melt the snow. In the kitchen we found 2 of them squabbling over the last handfuls of putrid potatoes. They had seized each other by their rags, and were fighting with curiously slow and uncertain movements, cursing in Yiddish between their frozen lips. In the courtyard of the storehouse there were 2 large piles of cabbages and turnips. Insipid turnips, the basis of our diet. They were so frozen that they could only be separated with a pickaxe. We carried out about 100 pounds. There was still more. A packet of salt, and a can of water, perhaps 12 gallons, frozen in a block. On the dawn of the 21st, we saw the plain, deserted and lifeless, white as far as the eye could see, lying under the flight of the crows, deathly sad. I would almost have preferred to see something moving again. We loaded ourselves with a bottle of vodka, various medicines, newspapers and magazines, and 4 first-rate eiderdowns, one of which is today in my house in Turin. Cheerful and irresponsible, we carried the fruits of our expedition back to the dormitory, leaving them in Arthur's care. Only that evening did we learn what happened perhaps only half an hour later. Some SS men, perhaps dispersed, but still armed, penetrated into the abandoned camp. They found that 18 Frenchmen had settled in the dining hall of the SS WAF. They killed them all methodically, with a shot in the nape of the neck, lining up their twisted bodies in the snow on the road. Then they left. The 18 corpses remained exposed until the arrival of the Russians. Nobody had the strength to bury them. But by now there were beds in all the huts occupied by corpses as rigid as wood, whom nobody troubled to remove. The ground was too frozen to dig graves. Many bodies were piled up in the trench, but already early on the heap showed out of the hole and was shamefully visible from our window. In one bed, clasping each other to resist the cold better, there were 2 Italians. I often heard them talking, but as I spoke only French, for a long time they were not aware of my presence. That day they heard my name by chance, pronounced with an Italian accent by Charles, and from then on they never ceased groaning and imploring. Naturally I would have liked to have helped them, given the means and the strength, if for no other reason than to stop their crying. In the evening, when all the work was finished, conquering my tiredness and disgust, I dragged myself gropingly along the dark, filthy corridor to their ward with a bowl of water and the remainder of our day's soup. The result was that from then on, through the thin wall, the whole diarrhea ward shouted my name day and night, with the accents of all the languages of Europe, accompanied by incomprehensible prayers, without my being able to do anything about it. I felt like crying. I could have cursed them. Charles climbed down from his bed and dressed in silence. While I held the lamp, he cut all the dirty patches from the straw mattress and the blankets with a knife. He lifted Lackmaker from the ground with the tenderness of a mother, cleaned him as best as possible with straw taken from the mattress, and lifted him into the remade bed, into the only position in which the unfortunate fellow could lie. He scraped the floor with a scrap of tin plate, diluted a little chloramine, and finally spread disinfectant over everything, including himself. 27 January. Dawn. On the floor, the shameful wreck of skin and bones. The somogi thing. There are more urgent tasks. We cannot wash ourselves, so that we dare not touch him until we have cooked and eaten. And besides, the latrine had to be emptied. The living are more demanding, the dead can wait. We began to work as on every day. The Russians arrived while Charles and I were carrying Somogi a little distance outside. He was very light. We overturned the stretcher on the grey snow. Charles took off his beret. I regretted not having a beret. Of the 11, Somogi was the only one to die in 10 days. Felilov died some weeks later in the temporary Russian hospital of Auschwitz. In April at Katowice, I met Schenk and Alkali in good health. Arthur has reached his family happily, and Charles has taken up his teacher's profession again. We have exchanged long letters, and I hope to see him again one day.